Good afternoon and welcome. My name is C. Riley Snorton, and I'm a professor of English and Gender and Sexuality Studies, as well as the interim faculty director for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Allow me to begin with a request for a moment of silence to honor those that were slain in the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. Roberta A. Drury, Marcus D. Morrison, Andre McNeil, Aaron Salter, Geraldine Talley, Celestine Anderson, Catherine Massey, Pearl Young, Ruth Whitfield. Thank you. The Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture is currently celebrating its 25th year as a hub of research and practice that advances scholarship, arts, and public discussion about the myriad ways race and racism inform scholarship, institutions, and lived experiences. Our annual public lecture features distinguished public intellectuals whose work promotes engaged thought and scholarship around the topics of race and ethnicity within the public sphere. Previous lecturers include Dr. Angela Davis, Danny Glover, Dr. Cornell West, Kathleen Neal Cleaver, and more recently, Jose Antonio Vargas and Reginald Dwayne Betts. Before introducing this year's annual public lecture, Black feminist theorist and literary critic, Professor Hortense J. Spillers, I'd like to thank the CSRPC team for making this possible. Tracy Matthews, Marilyn Willis, Jacqueline Gaines, Tiara Kilpatrick, and Beth Dewano, as well as our executive team, our executive committee, and CSRPC's former director and vice provost, Waldo Johnson. Thank you for your leadership and ongoing support. Now to introduce our esteemed guest. Throughout her career in word and in deed, Professor Hortense Spillers is a model of Black creative intellectualism, as her work continually attends to the contradictions and crises that animate and structure Black and Black feminist study and life. She is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Professor and Distinguished Research Professor Emerita at Vanderbilt University. She received a BA from the University of Memphis and earned her PhD in English at Brandeis University. She's held positions at Haverford College, Wellesley College, Emory University, and Cornell. She's also served as a guest professor in the program in literature at Duke University, as well as at the John F. Kennedy Center for North American Studies at the Free University in Berlin. Her work has been recognized by the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, and she's been a recipient of numerous fellowships, including the National Humanities Center Research Triangle and the Center for the Study of Behavioral Sciences, Palo Alto. She is the founder of the A-Line Journal, a journal of progressive thought, which is an online venue devoted to examinations of national and world events through a theoretical lens. She also co-founded with Tamara Lomax, the Feminist Wire, an online magazine dedicated to feminist issues and critique. Professor Spillers is the author of Black, White, and in Color, Essays on American Literature and Culture, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2003. She's the editor of Comparative American Identities, Race, Sex, and Nationality in Modern Texts with Routledge in '91, and with Marjorie Price, a co-editor of Conjuring, Black Women, Fiction, and Literary Tradition, published in 1985 on Indiana University Press. Professor Spillers is currently at work on several projects, including one on the idea of Black culture, and we eagerly anticipate the publication of Fabrics of History, Essays on the Black Sermon, forthcoming with Duke University Press. A renowned essayist, Professor Spillers has generated a vocabulary for thinking about race, gender and sexuality, psychoanalysis, kinship, and representation that continues to shape generations of thinkers. Her path-breaking 1987 essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American Grammar Book, is central to numerous canons, an exquisite piece of writing. Its poetics blur the lines between literary and critical text. In it, she draws a distinction between body and flesh, reformulating a basic unit of analysis in humanistic inquiry through attending to the position of the captive female in the grammars of American life. On writing this essay, Professor Spillers explains in an interview with Saidiya Hartman, Farah Jasmine Griffin, Shelley Eversley, and Jennifer Morgan, quote, "I wrote it with a sense of urgency, with a need to tell something that had been told over and over again. I knew that none of it was new. And so I was trying to ask the question, ask it anew, as if it had not been asked before. Because the language of the historian, no offense to any historians out there, was not telling me what I needed to know. Which is, what is it like in the interstitial spaces where you fall between everyone who has a name, a category, a sponsor, an agenda, spokespersons, people looking out for them, but you don't have anybody? That's your situation," end quote. As a scholar, teacher, mentor, and editor, Professor Spillers has been there for many. The first time I encountered Professor Spillers was as a graduate student. After submitting a piece on transness and the contradictions of Black male feminism to the Feminist Wire, I was shook to find the essay returned with her edits and suggestions running along the margins of the page. Part of what was so wild about that moment was that I felt so thoroughly shaped by her thinking, her words operating as an interstice, to quote her, both as that which allows us to speak about and that which enables us to speak at all, to my work in Black feminist, queer, and trans studies, such that it was incomprehensible to me at the time to imagine that she could ever be more than a friend of my mind. Professor Spillers' scholarship has sustained an investigation of the conditions of knowledge production and the tensions between institutionalization and movement work, such as in The Idea of Black Culture, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, a Post-Date, and Critical Theory in Times of Crisis. Playful and incisive, her prose invites reading and rereading to hear her words anew, as if for the first time, the stakes of which are palpable. For as she writes in Interstices, a small drama of words, we are, after all, talking about words as we realize that by their efficacy, we are damned or saved. We are grateful for the efficacy of your words and the vast worlds you've made with them. This afternoon, we have the profound honor to hear from Professor Spillers, her talk with a new title, which is called An Examination of the French Black Codes. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hortense Spillers.
Thank you very much, Riley, for that lovely introduction. It's very nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation to come to the University of Chicago once again. I was hoping that the weather would be a little warmer today, but it isn't. So I will have to come back when it's warmer. I had hoped to give another talk today, but that one isn't quite ready. And I know you don't come to a university like this one, certainly this one, and have half-baked stuff. So you will have to invite me back when that particular presentation is ready to give. So what I want to talk about today, Women and the Laws, which is a study of the French Black Codes, is part of a larger project that I embarked on some years ago. And those of you in this audience who may know me, projects that I have generally grow whiskers and long beards, right? So I'm still waiting on this one to reach whatever destination it's going to reach. My concern about the laws and its impact on Black populations is not a new subject with me. I have dealt with it in other places. This particular episode, though, a particular piece of a larger project, Le Code Noir, has to do specifically with the status of women during the revolutionary period in the world of the 18th century, specifically involves women in the birth of the modern French state, the birth of what becomes the United States, and the birth of Haiti. It is also, I should point out, an important effort in translation for me, because this work was sent to me by a colleague who, I think she still lives in the United Kingdom. And so if I wanted to read it, I would have to translate it. And so I did translate it, and I've always been a little bit proud of this translation. And so I'm going to speak to you from the translation of the work. And one of these days, I will find out how accurate the translation is, but I hope it has sufficient accuracy to be able to make a few guesses about it. In 1987, Luis Sala Molins, and I think this is a Spanish intellectual living in Paris, published a full text complete with critical commentary of the French Black Code, Le Code Noir, and subtitles his project, The Calvary of Canaan. We might also translate Le Calvaire de Canaan as the crucifixion of Canaan. The Code Noir began its long journey in Versailles at the court of the Sun King Louis XIV in March 1685, and was terminated a little short of 2 centuries later in April 1848 at the commencement of what Sala Molins called the ephemeral Second Republic. The 18th century saw at least 3 iterations and reiterations of the code in 1745, 1767, and 1788. Sala Molins' text is based on the 1767 edition of the code, reproduced in facsimile, unaccompanied by historiographical marginalia or critical commentary by the historical societies of Guadeloupe, at Basse-Terre, Martinique, at Fort-de-France in 1980. My own attempt to translate and read this text, sometimes in the 90s, has been compelled by my interest in comparative diasporic studies, but more than that, my curiosity about the fate of the partus sequitur ventrum, or the part is from the belly, which determines the fate of the newborn by way of the condition of the mother. This generational succession of bondage strikes me as the sine qua non of the peculiar institution, so that this specific naming of the female in her reproductive career takes us, it seems to me, to the very heart of the matter. From it, retrace the route of the reproductive function in polar opposition to the capacity to order one's world, and in its association with the blood element, traffics in the unspeakable, which eludes the public world of political address. And if you think about the way Aristotle addressed this issue in his works. The private sphere is the sphere of idiotes, idiotes. So this little bit of the paper riffs on Ivan Hannaford in his study of the idea of race in the West. So I put together a little Ivan Hannaford and a little Aristotle to come up with the conclusions that I draw in this particular section. Early on in Hannaford's text, he meticulously works at establishing what the idea of the political was in the classical world, the idea of the political, as he sees it in radical contradistinction to the notion of race. For Hannaford, the idea of the political represents what he calls an enormous leap that the contemporary world has failed to fully appreciate, in as much as it is emerging in an historical context where order had previously depended on the observation of hierarchical rules pertaining to household, family, clan, and tribe. In Greece and Rome, he observes, the transition from kith and kin to polity, from blood relationship to political relationship, cannot be explained using natural, evolutionary, or generic criteria. End of quote. One way to read this is to hear in its implications the division of social labor that will come to be named, in our understanding, public and private spheres of human interest and their theoretically rigorous gender protocols. In any case, in the ancient properties of the bloodline, and I am assuming that this is what Aristotle must have had in mind with the idiotes, the ancient properties of the bloodline as the males authored it, as male philosophers over time have authored it, woman power runs parallel with notions of contamination, defilement, ambiguity, obscurity, so that the domestic in this outline is perceived in proximity to filth. If you add color to this heady mix, then the spectacle of a consummate degradation is complete. This 17th century text, the Code Noir, is the oldest codification of law that I know of that is related to the regulation of commerce in the traffic of African peoples under enslavement, which lends another reason for my interest in it. By comparison, laws governing the bonded in colonial North America, the Black codes of the United States, were taken up colony by colony. There were also Hispanic codes that do the same thing. And in the case of the North American colonial laws, these entered the records of the transactions of state legislatures by degree. Not until 1705, for example, does the Virginia Assembly articulate the defining provision that removes all doubt of the synonymity between skin color and the status of enslavement. Quote, all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves in all courts of judicature and other places within this dominion shall be held, taken, and adjudged to be real estate. Even though Black people by the closing decades of the 17th century, were beginning to lose their ambiguity of status. And for some historians, those Black folk who landed at Jamestown in 1619 were not necessarily slaves. I think John Hope Franklin's Slavery to Freedom talks about the ambiguity of the status of those 19 Spanish-speaking Black people who arrived at Jamestown. In any case, by the closing decades of the 17th century, Black people were beginning to lose their ambiguity of status, as historians tend to agree that the rigorous demands of servitude applied early on across the racial fault lines. According to Helen Chatterall's massive study of legislative proceedings in each of the North American colonies, there were some 10 classes of indentured servants spelled out in early Virginia statutes. Can you imagine that? 10 different ways that people were classified according to their terms of indenture. It's almost as if everybody was hierarchized in some way. Between 1619, when Black people early appeared on these shores, and circa 1640, Black denizens of Virginia followed the pattern of indentured servitude. As historian Thad Tate explains it, like other servants, the Negroes completed a period of service and became free men. Some of them became landowners and masters of the servants. One Anthony Johnson, Tate reports, came to Virginia colony in 1621, and within a couple of years had finished his servitude, taking a wife after 1622, acquiring property, importing Negro servants of his own, and developing, quote, a small African community in Northampton County. So it looks like, rather than the opposite of what one would normally think would happen, slavery locks down the closer we come to the 20th century. In other words, the more time passes, the more we get a synonymity between Blackness automatically meaning enslavement. There is no single event then that augurs and argues the inevitability of slavery, which would cast it in divine order and rob it of its historicity. In other words, slavery is a historical event, and that's one of the reasons, or an historical eventuality. It's certainly more than a single event. That's why I tend not to use the word slave, but to use the word enslaved or bonded, because I think of a slave as a rock or a stone or a trees or something in nature. I don't think of slaves as anything in nature. They belong to the order of history. And once we get them in history, then we can talk about change, transformation, revolution, and so forth. So it appears that by slow degree and day by day, the African community is systematically divested of its civic potential, as paradoxically, the colonies and the colonists gain their own stride toward freedom. Slavery and freedom, the long-held conceptual antitheses, wax together so that, as Susan Buck Morris would have it, in Hegel, Haiti, and universal history, the discourse of freedom and the practice of slavery marked the ascendancy of a succession of Western nations within the early modern global economy. If for Enlightenment thinkers, Salomon's Lumiere, freedom is the highest and universal political value. Then the idea begins to take root, Buck Morris goes on, at precisely the time that the economic practice of slavery, the systematic, highly sophisticated, capitalist enslavement of non-Europeans as a labor force in the colonies, was increasingly quantitatively and increasingly qualitatively, to the point that by the mid-18th century, it came to underwrite the entire economic system of the West, paradoxically facilitating the global spread of the very Enlightenment ideals that were in such fundamental contradiction to it. So the Enlightenment and the rise and spread of slavery. As used as we are to the notion, this twinning of these antithetical views of the human still rivets the imagination as a precise impossibility. One cannot speak of freedom without conjuring up its negation. Salomon's study of Le Code Noir that audaciously indicts Enlightenment thinkers for what he calls their silence on the question of slavery and the code, sustains a posture of indignation toward both the oblivion to the matter of slavery that exists in official French scholarship and, quote, the obscene nudity of its articles that reflects centuries of exegesis on African humanity, beginning with canonical authors. From what he tells the reader, the confrontation that he poses here between the philosophers and Black slavery has netted him a great deal of ridicule in some quarters, but ridicule in this case seems justification enough for a late 20th century dossier on the code that, quote, regulated the coldest utilitarian genocide of modernity, as Solomon describes it. As Marx of Capital leaves blood on the floor, so to speak, in taking on the political economists with whom he disagrees, so Solomon assumes the posture of aggressively taking on the French intellectual world in navigating his way without apology through the minefields of his theoretical predecessors as well as his contemporaries. At the end of a calendar of events, which he inaugurates with 8 January 1454, before Columbus, right? And Pope Nicholas V's authorization to the King of Portugal, where the sub-Saharan trade begins in the middle of the 15th century. Solomon marks the second centennial of the code by noting the convening of the Berlin Conference in 1885. The third centennial of the code in 1985. And he speaks of the ways that the French handled that third centennial. The occasion, he explains, was completely ignored by the French press, radio, and television. Then in a separate sidebar on the page, there is this evocation, which is of particular interest to me at this moment in world history. 9 December 1948, the definition of genocide is adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And it says this: recognizing that in all periods of history, genocide has inflicted great losses on humanity, the General Assembly proclaims. In the present convention, genocide means any one of the following acts committed with the intention of destroying, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, such as the murder of members of the group, a serious attack on the physical and mental integrity of the group, the intentional subjection of a group to conditions of existence with the view of bringing about its total or partial physical destruction. Measures aimed at hampering births within the group, the coercive transfer of the children from one group to another group. The inclusion of the UN Convention on Genocide is not a leisurely or otious decision on Solomon's part. Given the time frame of the convention, it is coming within earshot of the cessation of hostilities among nations at global war and the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust. But the implied reflexive gesture that Solomon performs here for all the complexities of such a move and nation states in our era tending to shy away from the term, backdates the concept of genocide to the transatlantic slave trade that had already been in motion for 2.5 centuries before the promulgation of Le Code Noir. Solomon, in response to those who felt that he wanted to take down or belittle the philosophers, offers that his aims were far more modest. By preparing another edition of the code and bringing parallel alongside it the career of the most glorious philosophical period of French culture, he was departing from the monster of oblivion in concern about the nation's political health and to offer to whomever wished an accurate instrument for pondering the failures of a thought whose success one is obligated to rein in. It takes the reader a while to reach the articles themselves after a lot of introductory gestures, but the care that he takes to lay out and examine in considerable detail the nuances of the code and its intellectual and conceptual legacies reaps its rewards in the second part of the text. I want to briefly mention one of the threads that he follows in the commentary and its ramifying consequences, and that is the name Canaan, with whose career we are already quite familiar. The story of Noah and his 3 sons is told in Genesis 9th chapter, 20th through 27th verses. Specifically, the error that Ham commits will be, as you recall from your Sunday school lessons or lessons at the synagogue, that Ham commits will be transmuted as the malediction that falls on successive generations of Ham's children, beginning with his son, Canaan. And this is punishment for laughing at the father in his drunken nakedness. The trail of biblical exegesis that follows Ham's curse is a long and torturous one, but suffice it to say that the curse became one of the preeminent rationalizations, as we recall, that slaveholders adopted to their arsenal of defense for not only upholding the practices of slavery, but for sustaining such practices over 4 long centuries of early modern and modern industrial history. In short, the descendants of Ham, installed in distant regions in unknown lands, will emerge in the literature of the Japhetic, he argues, as concomitant with Black Africa. The geographical rationale, and those of you who know this text will remember that Professor Nell Painter in The History of White People talks about the role that geography and climate play in working out those different positions concerning race. So the geographical rationale, among a host of reasons for the infliction of enslavement on New World Africans, and as one of the inspiring motivations behind race thinking, has been with us for a long time. As Painter explains, classical writers Hippocrates and Herodotus, among them, turned to climate, airs, waters, and places to account for human difference. Successive generations of scholars and writers will elaborate the Hamitic thesis as the exegetical tradition allows the whole of the Black African population to be contained in Canaanite paternity. Eventually, color is wed to geographical features and political cultural space in fashioning not only the textual destiny of Black Africa, but its actual and material circumstance. Solomon Lenz would have us bear in mind that the Code's preamble and Article 1 drive home the idea that royal authority is advancing this document for the benefit of its officers and agents in the colonial isles of America in order to maintain the discipline of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church. That the Code conforms to a messianic project is spelled out in the first article that mandates the expulsion of Jews within 3 months of the publication of the Code from the American islands because of their declared enmity. The document reads, to quote the Christian name. Everywhere then, references to the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion permeate the provisions of the document in order to justify its declarations concerning a repertoire of human activity, from birthing to marriage to buying and selling. Relatedly, Article 2 demands the baptism of the enslaved recently brought to the islands and their instruction in the religion of the Catholic Church. We would be forgiven for regarding this obsessive gaze at the church and indeed at religiosity as a primary motivation with a great deal of cynicism, because the drafters, the ministers of the Sun King, speak plainly as though slavery were as natural as breathing in the air. Never once apparently is there stuttering or throat clearing in the syntax. For instance, we enjoin the inhabitants who buy newly arrived Negroes, for example, moves right along with dispatch to the end of the period. And we observe this language of decree, of words in aggressive action, as one of the quite astonishing stylistic dimensions of the Black Code. Colin Diane argues in Haiti, History and the Gods, that the work of the Marquis de Sade might be read, quote, as a literalization of the Black Code and the record of those practices that exceeded its regulations. First time I ever saw anybody take the Marquis de Sade and do that with it. That it's a way to read slavery, right? That it's a kind of literalization of it. Determined to strip French history of its glory, the Marquis brought out the truth, she goes on, quote, at the heart of the traffic in slaves, not only economic gain, but the tempting and pleasurable reduction of human into thing. The tempting and pleasurable reduction of human into thing. Like a persistent drone that subtends some lighter rhythm, in this case, economic gain under the aegis of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion. And every time the code needs to call on authority, it uses all three of those designations, Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion, over and over and over again. The reduction of human to thing and the remarkably unquestioned commerce that drives it everywhere infuses this document with so odious an intention that its feints of high moral and religious motivation even deceive it. Articles 8 through 13 concerning marriage and concubinage bear out this sense of a reading and bring us to a point of focus. Article 8 declares that subjects of the king who are not of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion are incapable of contracting valid marriages, and that children born to such liaisons are legitimate, as they will be, quote, held and reputed to be true conjunctions of concubinage. Annette Gordon Reed, a name you will recognize from her studies of Jefferson and its Monticello histories, points out that under the laws of Virginia, quote, any child born out of wedlock was considered filius nullius, filius nullius, the child of no one. This uncanny manipulation of the rituals of union in the case of the code and the social status of children in both instances seems designed to reinforce the juridical negation of the enslaved. No civil rights are accorded to or recognized in the bondsman, the bondswoman, which extends by way of the imposition of illegitimacy to heritable rights as well. This disingenuous reliance on the evocation of the sacraments of marriage in the case of the code might be regarded as yet one more ruse for the absolute police power that authority wielded over its subordinates. Article 9 makes free men who have had children with concubines subject to penalty. But interestingly, the masters of the enslaved with whom they have had children will be deprived of the enslaved and the children, and the latter confiscated without the benefit of emancipation or without the power of emancipation inhering in the enslaved. This article does not apply when the free man marries the enslaved woman, but only in the forms observed by the church. The enslaved female is liberated in this way and her children rendered free and legitimate. If one reads an article like this one in isolation from the environing context, it will appear that the outlined procedure offers a possible route out of bondage, but the involute and labyrinthine modifications and exceptions that qualify and contradict any given rule or any given rule in relationship to another provision would suggest that the entire code, as Solomon Lenz contends, is fashioned to assure the generational succession of enslavement, the matrilineal transmission of freedom or bondage, and the juridical disempowerment of the subordinate. Article 10 mandates that the solemnities of marriage will be observed for free and slave alike without entailing the consent of the parents of the enslaved. The only necessary and compulsory approval that matters in this case is the master's. Article 11 expressly forbids priests from officiating at marriage ceremonies of the enslaved without the master's approval. This article further specifies that the owner is forbidden to use whatever measures of constraint at his disposal to force the enslaved to marry against their will. Solomon Lenz argues that it is rather pointless to linger over this provision supposed to prevent the masters from exercising a force of will, inasmuch as the enslaved certainly has no ability to haul a master into court or question his will otherwise. Relatedly, Article 30 spells out the inability of the enslaved to constitute himself, herself, as an agent by anyone, not the master, for managing or negotiating any matter or becoming arbiters, experts, or witnesses in any civil or criminal procedure. For all intents and purposes, the enslaved, from the point of view of the law, has no agency that another is bound to respect, and none, period. The Saint-Domingue Revolution offers an answer to that question in the next century. Given Article 30's definitive categories that negate a gential possibility in the enslaved, then, Solomon Lenz is right to declare that it is highly improbable that an enslaved person's complaint against a master would have been met with the least efficacy. Article 12 specifies that the children born of enslaved parents will be enslaved, but that the children will belong to the master of the female rather than the master of the male if the pair is of different masters. Solomon Lenz calls this provision the height of slavery's disaster insofar as it locks up the future in the enslaved, or the future of the enslaved, in a kind of timelessness, in an eternal night of repetition. Of the 6 articles that bear on concubinage in marriage, Article 13 decrees that if an enslaved husband is married to a free woman, the children, male and female, will follow the condition of the mother. And that's the partus sequitur vintrem, right? The children will be enslaved as well as the mother. Supplementary prohibitions provided by ordinances adopted after 1685 disallow marriages between white subjects of either sex with Black men and Black women. The penultimate article of Le Code Noir, number 59, grants to any freed person all the rights, privileges, and immunities, quote, enjoyed by, I don't see how they could twist their mouth to use that word. Of course, it wasn't enjoy, right? It's a translation. But enjoy, anything that approaches that seems the wrong word here, but grants to any freed person all the rights, privileges, and immunities enjoyed by persons born free. The article goes on to wish that the merit of acquired liberty will produce for them, for their person as well as their goods, the same effects that the happiness of natural liberty brings to other subjects of the crown. Solomon Lens pauses at the notion of same rights of access as others because it does not mean access, for instance, that the nobility has, which was not a minor barrier, he observes, during the ancient regime, nor access to classes of whites, and particularly those subjects affected by feudal and seigneurial rights, many of which will be swept away by revolution. Signed by the king and his minister Colbert, and sealed with the great seal in red and green folds of silk, the document was read, published, and registered at Saint-Domingue on May 6, 1687. All right. There are many more pages of this that I don't think I'm going to test your patience to listen to, right? So I'm going to kind of skip to the end of this, although I do want to point out just a couple of things along the way. A number of provisions supplemental to the code and introduced in the 18th century that bear on the spatial prescriptions of non-white public facing. From 1733, the king decrees that, quote, any mixed race inhabitant can exercise no responsibility in the judiciary or in the military. And he added that any inhabitant who marries a negress or a mulatto cannot be an officer nor gain any employment in the colonies. Mixed race persons cannot have any profession that places them even remotely close to judicial functions or dispositions not related to themselves, for these occupations can hardly be entrusted to persons whose probity is not recognized and which one cannot presume to meet in a birth as the ones prescribed. And what I'm getting at here is what the code seems to suggest, that anything having to do with publicness is a part of the prohibition that these codes operate by. So the last few pages of this, I don't know quite how to describe one's objection to the coldness of the French Code or the body of law that slavery engendered in the South of the North American colonies. The rhetoric of law itself, stripped down to the nub of any given occasion, seems to lose any hint of actual human hoping, aspiring life buried beneath its highness that deigns to touch the ground. Indeed, in the mirror of legal rhetoric, I, the shifting pronoun, is lost to sight, and what emerges in its place is something of a cipher out of time, but rather clocked instead by the mechanisms of an impartial device that appears to be wielded by no one. And that's the terror of it. It is not only that one disagrees with so many of these rulings, but the idea that the enslaved are like play toys or toys to an overriding legion of power over life and death. For the most part, we are apprised in these documents, not of human movement, but of the transfer and transportation and poses and dispositions of things. There are not women and men here, but rather the perambulatory stuff that is subject to the whims of a preponderance of power. As Colin Diane puts it, Women in Saint-Domingue, for instance, whether nuns in Cape Francais, mulatto courtesans, Black slaves, or white Creole wives were vessels for the taxonomic vocation of white male supremacy, obsessed with naming things and fixing them in static and definitive order. Thomas Morris, in his massive study, Southern Slavery and the Law, 1619 to 1860, takes up the problem of the partu sequitur when Trim in the second chapter of his text. The first statutory provision on status was adopted in Virginia in 1662. All children born in this country shall be held bond or free according to the condition of the mother. Morris launches his investigation of this maxim because he is trying to discover if the Southern colonies seek their legal precedents, in this case from English common law or civil law. My interest here, however, is caught by other detail, some of which I spelled out at the beginning of this talk, but there's something else with which I want to close, and it is this. More than any other provision, this one, to my mind, draws out in stunning clarity the moral disaster that slavery was and the degree to which the crucifixion of Canaan devolves on the nameless, faceless female who bears the weight, if we can make this figure work, of the stain. As Morris explains, the law of 1662 did not contain the phrase partus sequitur ventrum, nor did any other Southern statute to the end of slavery in 1865. In his reading, then, the law was adopted to efface uncertainty concerning the status of mulattoes, and to my mind, that term is a troublesome term. I think of it as a heuristic device. It does not describe human beings or historical persons. It's something you use to define something else. It doesn't have anything to do with people, to me. So that it's quite an ugly word, but it was all over the vocabulary of slavery and some of its aftermath. So that when I use it here, I'm using it according to the way it turns up in the text, but not because I believe in the term itself. I think of it as a kind of fiction, right? And the concept of the mulatto as a kind of substitutive move. It is a way to disappear Blackness, to make it go away. The Black person is there, but not really. And so I think that's the way it's being used by diminutive power to do something with the presence of Africanity in these societies. So as Morris talks about it in the book Southern Slavery and the Law, the partus sequitur ventrum, or following the condition of the mother, is an example of what has been called intellectual sloppiness in legal theory. The term was explained by Blackstone in his commentaries on the law. And when Blackstone discusses the principle of the partus sequitur ventrum, he's treating it largely as a rule to determine the ownership of the increase of personal property. And here the common and civil law agreed. In the mid-18th century, Blackstone put the matter thusly, quote, of all tame and domestic animals. So it's a reference, first of all, to animals. The brood belongs to the owner of the dam or mother. The English law agreeing with the civil that partu sequitur ventrum in the brute creation, though for the most part in the human species, it disallows the maxim. Morris argues that Blackstone at this point treated the Latin phrase not as a rule that determined the status of someone, but as a rule that determined the ownership of something. So we see how inappropriate it was to make that application in the first place. So the dilemma of the Virginia Burgesses was whether or not they were thinking of so-called mulattoes as persons. And if so, the law of bastardy, it was called, would hold that the child followed the mother, or thinking of mulattoes in terms of property rights, in which case chattel property required that the increase go to the owner of the mother. Blackstone, in his synthesis of English law, Morris argues, had squeezed together a rule of status and a rule of property under the same Latin phrase. In any case, we do not see women here. In fact, humanity reduced to movable chess pieces against the ground of public figures in a dance of ego is obscured. We are today, as Enlightenment legatees and for all the distance we've come, still searching for her face on the horizon. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. We have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Would you like to sit here or would you like to remain at the podium?
Oh, I can stay here.
Okay.
Yeah, this is fine.
Okay, great. So I mean, there was so much in that talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that there are many questions both online and in the audience, but maybe if I could get started,
right.
I'd love to actually kind of think a little bit more about how you began the talk around the idea of politics and the idea of race. And what I heard as you kind of what you attuned us to in the code, which reminded me very much of the idea of culture, especially as culture bears a kind of relation to religion, agriculture, and colonization, in, for example, Raymond Williams' terms. So I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little more, especially as I know I'm still taking on board the kind of concluding notes of your talk, which require us to think about culture as perhaps, well, let me see if this is what you feel, but what I'm hearing is that culture is also a way of legislating things. And that
legislating
things. Yeah, and that the code, in fact, sets up a culture of a certain kind of culture of power in which the kind of figure of the human is constantly made absent, and that is particularly noted or seen in this this phrase, this sloppy form of legislation of partus sequitur ventrum. So to take one more step back, I'm curious about how culture figures into this articulation of the politics of race and the idea of race and the idea of politics through the French Black Code.
Okay.
Yeah. I hope that's clear. I hope that makes some sense.
That's the big question.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can do this piece by piece. You know, I'm beginning to understand why Raymond Williams, toward the end of his career, repudiated sort of the things he'd said about culture. And so I'm beginning to think that the topic of culture is probably a lot more riddled and difficult than I have been giving it credit for. I think I have been thinking of it as all positive. And I think what I'm going to have to do is try and come to grips with the ways in which it is at least, it presents us with an ambiguous picture, or it is something about which we should remain ambivalent, which means, to my mind, that you try and mount a paradox, right? That you're really on two runaway horses, or you're caught between Scylla and Charybdis, or the devil and the deep blue sea, and you're really trying to negotiate both things at the same time. So if culture is on the side of the political, which is where I think I would place it, at least in thinking about your question. If that's the case, it already starts its life as that which has made a hierarchical decision or a vertical decision, because it has declared its own relationship to publicness. And this is the way I'm understanding Hannaford's argument, that the political idea in his argument, which is a very compelling argument, is that the political idea goes against the idea of blood, and that's what he is opposing it to. And so it is the sphere of the laws, and as we know, it becomes the sphere of a society of equals, and those equals are male. So for the longest time, the domestic, where the female is located, had nothing to do with public facing life. So I'm thinking that perhaps culture, at least discursively, is related to the political, right? That discursively they are neighbors, if not twins. And if that is the case, then culture is always defining itself, perhaps political too, as Hannaford is arguing it, in that history of metaphysics that our age has said it's deconstructing or dismantling.
Yeah.
So it may be that if you get politics and culture and publicness defining itself in one way, then you've got over on this side that is defined by embodiment, embodiedness, or the racialized perception of reality. So there may be a split or a dichotomy in that way. I mean, just think, I would have to think about that a lot more. But it seems to me that might be one way to look at it, because Hannaford is certainly describing the political against everything that we know about, let's say, the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's all about blood and carnage. The power of the female and so forth. According to him, the political idea opposes that. And he thinks that it opposes the notion of race. He also thinks that the notion of race is not as eternal as the contemporary period would make it, right? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
There's a hand here, and I know a mic should be. Oh, perfect.
Dr. Schwartz, thanks so much for joining us and giving us this new work. I really was interested in an early kind of thing that you said about, the importance of thinking about slavery as an event and it belonging to the order of history. And I wanted to hear you kind of like talk a little bit more about like the stakes of like that framing. Because the stakes, right? So one being the stakes of like what it means to like represent enslaved subjectivity.
Yeah.
It seemed like, right, the difference between, right, slave and enslaved people is an important one for you, and subjectivity and its representation seems to be like what might be at work there.
Uh-huh.
And then the other, which is kind of like what that means for slavery and its like pastness. Because, as many of us kind of like have encountered contemporary work on right representing slavery, like, right, a lot of like what's in question is like, right, its pastness, or what you might think of as, right, it's the unfinished business of freedom for some folks, or, right, there's an ever expanding like present, as Ian Balcom would put it. So yeah, pastness and subjectivity. And I'm wondering like what thinking of slavery as a thing that, as an event that belongs to history, kind of like means for those two questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. The stakes, you said, was one, right? It's very important to me for those of us who come after, those of us belateds, much later people, that it's very important for us to try to understand that we are not talking about permanence. When we talk about enslavement, I don't care how long it lasted, that we're not talking about human personality, and I don't care what was done to them. For me, they were always human beings they were suffering human beings. And that for me is enough to make the question about the humanity of the enslaved a kind of ridiculous question. It's a question that I'm beginning not to believe. I'm beginning to think that that's not what they meant, that there's something behind that presumption of non-humanity that is telling us something about the person who's doing the presuming, more about that person than it is about the one that is presumed about. So it's important for me to understand that however long it lasted and whatever happened to those persons involved, that we are not talking about what was ordered from above or what belonged to cosmic order, that it was never in the divine order, which is the defense that slaveholders often presented about slavery, that this is in keeping with what religion calls for, or what the divine order, that we are bringing Christianity to the savage and so forth. None of that works for me, and I think that it shouldn't work for anybody. And it's important that it not work, because I think you draw different conclusions if you decide that you have to always stay in history rather than in time immemorial, that you have to stay in the historical order. And if you stay there, then you're always talking about the humanity of the enslaved as well as the humanity of the enslaver. I mean, one has to believe that it's possible to turn those situations around, as they often are turned around. And so that's what's at stake. I mean, and so for me, it's almost, well, it's kind of an extension, as I see it, of my own existential sense of the world. I mean, it's, I have to believe that because I believe that I'm human myself. And so I accord that to others. And so that's what I think the stakes are. I think the stakes are really very high. And the second part of your question was
about like what's entailed about temporality and kind of like framing slavery as belonging to the order of history, and kind of like what that framing means for other ones, like the afterlives of slavery, the unfinished business of freedom.
the past,
et cetera.
yes.
Yeah.
The past and so forth. I think what that means for me is that I don't really believe that because I am a Black person, I must accept the idea of social death for myself now. I don't think that. I think that I have to be aware of humiliation as a possibility for all of us creatures, right? And so far as I'm concerned, there is a past, present, and future for a Black personality. And it's different depending on when you speak. All of it does not melt or disappear under the description of social death. Does that make sense? I am not, as I'm reading it, a latter-day slave. And if another Black person tells me that, it doesn't make it true. Or I don't go along with the program, just, you know. So I don't believe that at all. And so that's the dimension, that temporal dimensionality is what Africanness has often been denied. Starting with Hegel's argument about how time does not pass in Black Africa, that it's in some kind of timeless zone or some zone of timelessness. So that I want to accord African humanity its time, its times, its temporal dimensions. And if that's so, then we're always talking about personality that is continuing to evolve or become, so that it's human becoming as well as human being, right? I mean, we're always making discoveries about. And so that's important for me. And if you can reach that conclusion, if you can be open to the possibility that those 19 folk who landed at Jamestown might be open to some other description other than that of enslavement, then let's see if we can see what that was. I'm not for denying anything. I mean, I'm for admitting whatever I can understand happened. But then I am also open to the birth of other humans. I'm also open to the idea of a second birth, right? That we are born once, but then we're also born a second time. And that second time birth is when we come into an understanding of any number of things. I mean, ourselves in relationship to other human beings is what I would call a second birth. So I'm always, so I need to keep the future open. And in that sense, I don't know what's down the road. And I don't look at the road and say, well, it's gonna always be this way. I don't believe that for a moment. So that's the way I would read that whole thing about past. Yeah.
That was really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Wow. I think we might have room for one more question if there is another question.
I think the lady on the balcony had a question here. Right, yeah, did you have? Anything else?
Oh, there's a hand. I see.
This lady?
Yes.
Hi, Professor Spillers. Thank you again for taking the time to come and speak with us and also just answer questions. Something that I've been wrestling with since you said it, and I may be misquoting you, so please correct me. But during your talk, you mentioned, the tempting and pleasurable reduction of the human to the thing in relationship to this like unquestioned commerce that drives it everywhere, is what you said. And it was clear in that moment you were talking about the unquestioned commerce of slavery, at least in my understanding, but I'm wondering if you could speak more to like what you believe that unquestionable commerce to be now that could be driving this reduction.
Okay, let me see if I understand it. A commerce that is driving the reduction of human, is that?
Yes, I'm just like, that was a phrase that you had said in your talk, and I'm just wondering if you could expand a bit on that.
I think that would get into what I see happening across our contemporary scene, and not just to Black humanity, or perhaps not even primarily Black humanity. Because I read the picture this way. And when I came to this understanding, I had to get up out of the bed where I was trying to sleep, because it was like, oh, I think I got to get up and sit up on that one. And it goes something like this. If you tolerate enslavement long enough, and if you dehumanize others long enough, you eventually become that thing yourself. And so I'm thinking that this society that we are in, that can barely sustain human life, I think we're in a situation in the United States where we have become a nation that is ungovernable. We can make no laws to protect us against people who would come in this room and just blow us all away in an afternoon, right? And we do it day in and day out. We can make no laws to protect the vote, for instance. And so what kind of society is it that can no longer take care of its business? It can't save its children. Doesn't seem very interested in its children, so that the whole business about anti-abortion, for example, is to my ears a lie. I don't think we are a society that gives a damn about children of any race. You burn books, you burn ideas, and your children can't read about 1619 because that's going to make them feel bad about themselves. Who are they kidding? They don't care about their children. So I think what I'm saying is that the legacy of slavery belongs to the United States. It doesn't belong to just a community, and that what happened to Black Americans has eventually happened in a different sense, perhaps, that we would have to use different ways of describing it, but that it has happened to an entire society, has been dehumanized and undone and unmade by deeds that were committed a long time ago, but that continue to morph into problems of the contemporary period. So that when we talk about cleanup, it's a whole society that has to clean itself up and acknowledge its errors, because they have been massive. They have not been done just to me and my ancestors, but it has been done to an entire society. And the more I see of where we are in American society, the more I believe that. There are people who really believe by what, 30, 40%? What a con man tells them? What fools are telling them? My region, the South, where I was born, wants to go back and be the Confederacy again? Are you kidding me? What is that about? So it's a kind of nuttiness, right? Which for me is a massive psychosis that needs treatment by doctors and priests and preachers, all the ones that are honest. So that's the way I would read your question. I've sort of stopped carving out slavery as a Black question and have started wondering what are the implications of slavery for an entire society, an entire modern society that thinks of itself as advanced, the most advanced nation in the world. It becomes a nation that has greater incarceration rates than any other society on the face of the earth, that cannot assure that its people are going to survive along a number of levels of stresses. So that for me, that's the sign that, well, things fall apart. The center does not hold, some famous poet said. I think that's right. And now I think I know what did it. That the society that even tolerates slavery within its midst don't have to practice it. Oh, well, we didn't do that in the North. You tolerated it. You compromised with it every step along the way. And so that's where we are. I mean, a society that couldn't find its way to truth if it kicked it in the butt for a large percentage of the people. So I think it's that for me is the legacy of slavery. The contemporary United States, where are we now? And that tells you a few things about what that meant.
Wow.
How's that?
I think that
Is that
Thank you. Thank you.
thanks.
I hope that folks will join us at the reception. Thank you so much, Professor Spillers,
Thank you
for the
very
amazing
much.
talk and Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much. Isn't that good? Thank you.